Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
To understand Paul Doyle, you first have to understand the world he was born into. According to Doyle himself, the story began in Manchester during the 1950s. His mother was Jewish. His father was Irish. Together they had 7 children, 6 boys and 1 girl. It was a working-class upbringing during a period when many families across Britain were struggling simply to get by. Money was scarce, opportunities were limited, and family life was far from stable. Eventually, the relationship between his parents broke down. The children became divided between the 2 sides of the family. Some remained with their mother. Others stayed with their father. Paul ended up being raised by his father. But his father faced a difficult challenge. Not only was he trying to raise children in difficult circumstances, he was also working long hours simply to survive. During the day he worked. At night, he worked again. According to Doyle, his father sometimes worked as a bodyguard around illegal gambling operations, bringing in whatever money he could to support the family. That meant long periods where the children were effectively left to their own devices. For many youngsters, this might have meant mischief. For Paul and his older brother Michael, it quickly escalated into something much more serious. By their own admission, they were already breaking into shops while still in primary school. At an age when most children were worrying about homework, they were roaming Manchester streets late at night, stealing sweets, breaking into properties, taking whatever they could find. The police regularly found them wandering the city in the early hours of the morning, sometimes at 2 o'clock, sometimes at 3, sometimes even later. They would be returned home. Their father would punish them. Yet within days, they would be back out again. The cycle continued. Eventually, the authorities reached a conclusion. The boys could not be controlled. And before he had even reached his 9th birthday, Paul Doyle was taken into care. Looking back decades later, he would describe entering the care system as entering a completely different world. A world governed by discipline, routine, punishment, and violence. For the next 10 years, that world would shape everything he became. Modern audiences often struggle to understand just how harsh Britain's old reform schools could be. These institutions were designed to turn troubled children into disciplined young men. In reality, many former residents describe environments that often resembled military camps more than schools. Paul Doyle certainly saw them that way. He recalled being dressed in heavy boots and institutional clothing, marching through corridors, standing to attention, following orders without question. Everything revolved around discipline. Everything revolved around obedience. According to Doyle, many of the attitudes within the system still reflected an older Britain shaped by 2 world wars. Children were expected to obey, to endure, to toughen up. And if they failed to do so, punishment followed. The reality was brutal. Dormitories housed large numbers of boys together. Violence was common, bullying was common, and weakness was often exploited. For a small, dark-haired boy who found himself isolated from many of the others, survival quickly became the priority. Doyle would later claim that he learned an important lesson during these years. If someone attacked him, he could not simply absorb it. He had to hit back, and hit back hard. According to his own account, if he was assaulted during the day, he would wait until nightfall. Then he would take a metal bed frame component from his bunk and seek revenge. The result was predictable. He soon developed a reputation as a boy who refused to be bullied, but it also created problems. Staff eventually decided he could no longer be trusted in the communal dormitories. Instead, he was isolated, separated from other boys, viewed as a troublemaker, viewed as a risk, viewed as someone who required special handling. The irony was that the system designed to control him was also helping to create the man he would later become. Every day became a lesson in conflict. Every day became a lesson in survival. And every day reinforced a simple belief. Nobody was going to protect him except himself. If the reform schools taught Paul Doyle how to survive, one incident during his early teenage years convinced him that he could survive almost anything. It was a lesson that would shape the rest of his life. By the age of 12, Doyle was already running away from institutions on a regular basis. The streets of Manchester had become familiar territory. He would sleep wherever he could, sometimes in abandoned buildings, sometimes in public toilets, sometimes in stolen vehicles. The care system had failed to contain him, and he had no intention of staying where others wanted him. One morning, after spending the night sleeping in a public toilet, he emerged into the cold Manchester dawn, hungry, tired, and looking for something to eat. He stole a bottle of milk from outside a shop and began drinking it in the street. That seemingly insignificant act led to his first criminal charge, but more importantly, it reinforced a growing hatred of authority. The police arrested him and returned him to the system. It would not be the last time. Far from it. Over the coming years, Doyle found himself involved in increasingly serious offences. Burglaries, thefts, breaking into warehouses, stealing cars. The pattern was already established. Each arrest simply became another part of life. But one arrest would affect him more than any other. Looking back years later, Doyle recalled being arrested after being caught with a large amount of money in his possession. The police wanted answers. They wanted to know where the cash had come from. He refused to tell them. According to Doyle, the officers began slapping him around the face during questioning. For many young teenagers, that would have been enough. Not for him. When one of the officers struck him, Doyle hit back. At just 12 years old, it was an act of defiance that carried consequences. The officers allegedly responded with a savage beating. Doyle claimed they dragged him into a cell and assaulted him repeatedly. Punch after punch, blow after blow, until he was left covered in blood. His injuries were serious enough that he later required hospital treatment. Most people would remember such an experience with fear. Paul Doyle remembered it differently. Sitting alone in the aftermath, covered in blood and nursing his injuries, he claims a thought entered his head, a thought that would stay with him for the rest of his life. If two grown men couldn't finish me, who could? To many people, it sounds like a strange conclusion, but for Doyle, it became a turning point. The experience convinced him that he could endure punishment, that he could absorb pain, that fear itself was often worse than the reality. And once a person truly believes that, they become a very different proposition. Years later, when people would ask him about his reputation as a fighter, Doyle often dismissed the stories about his punching power. Instead, he focused on something else: his ability to take punishment, his willingness to keep coming forward, his refusal to back down. In his own mind, that was where his confidence came from, not from hurting people, but from surviving what others couldn't. Whether that belief was entirely justified or not, it became central to the mythology that would eventually surround him. Because from that point onwards, Doyle increasingly approached confrontations with a mindset that would become his trademark. He would not wait. he would not negotiate, and he would not allow situations to develop. If he sensed trouble, he struck first. According to Doyle, many of his later fights followed exactly that pattern. Years spent in institutions had taught him to read people quickly. A glance, a posture, a look across a room. To him, these were warning signs, signals that a confrontation might be coming, and rather than waiting to find out, he preferred to launch the attack himself. It was a survival mechanism born in reform schools, but on the streets of Salford, it helped create a reputation that was growing rapidly. The small, stocky teenager who had spent most of his childhood in institutions was becoming known for something else entirely: violence. And before long, people were starting to take notice. Not just the police, not just rival youths, but some of the most feared young criminals in Salford. Among them was a man who would become one of the most important figures in Doyle's life. A man whose name would one day become synonymous with Manchester's Underworld, Paul Massey, and together they were about to enter a world far bigger and far more dangerous than anything either had experienced before. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Paul Doyle's reputation was no longer confined to Salford. People knew his name in Manchester, they knew his face, and increasingly, they knew exactly what he was capable of. But there was another world where reputations mattered just as much as they did on the streets. Football. More specifically, Manchester United's hooligan scene. To understand why so many young men were drawn into football violence during this period, you have to remember that away days were unlike anything supporters experience today. There was no social media, no mobile phones, no constant surveillance, no banning orders on the scale that would later emerge. For a certain type of supporter, travelling the country following Manchester United was about far more than football. It was about reputation, status, territory, and proving yourself against rival firms. For men like Doyle, who had already spent years fighting on the streets, football violence felt like a natural extension of the world they already inhabited. The same faces appeared, the same characters travelled, the same rivalries existed. The only difference was the setting. Instead of pubs and clubs, the battleground became train stations, city centres and football grounds. And Manchester United were travelling everywhere. Domestically, nationally, eventually internationally. The rise of Sir Alex Ferguson's side meant European trips became increasingly common. For most supporters, those journeys represented adventure. For others, they represented opportunity. Among those trips, one journey would become particularly memorable: a trip to Istanbul. Years before football supporters became familiar with modern Turkey, travelling there felt like entering a completely different world. Few United fans had any real idea what awaited them. According to Doyle, the atmosphere felt hostile from the moment they arrived. The culture shock was immediate. The language, the streets, the unfamiliar surroundings, and, most importantly, the local hostility towards visiting English supporters. The stories Doyle later told about Istanbul bordered on the surreal. Some were funny, others were chaotic. Many highlighted just how volatile the situation became. He recalled seeing fellow United supporters being chased through the streets by groups of local men. He described bars filling with hostile crowds, tensions building with every passing hour, a sense that violence was never more than seconds away. Then came the explosion. One incident sparked another. Arguments became fights. Fights became riots. Suddenly, hundreds of Turkish men were gathering around the hotel where many United supporters were staying. The situation rapidly spiraled out of control. According to Doyle, police buses were required to rescue supporters from locations across the city. Some arrived back at the hotel covered in blood. Others had stories of running battles through the streets. Within hours, what had begun as a football trip had become something far more serious. Looking back, Doyle almost seemed amused by the chaos, but beneath the humour was a reality that many supporters faced during that era. European away days could be genuinely dangerous. And Istanbul was a perfect example. The hotel itself became a battleground. Furniture was dragged across entrances, supporters barricaded doors, crowds gathered outside. Police struggled to maintain control. Eventually, many fans realised they faced a choice: remain inside and risk arrest, or escape. Doyle chose escape. He later described climbing from a hotel window and sprinting through the streets faster than he believed possible. For a man who had spent his entire life confronting danger head-on, even he recognised when the odds had become overwhelming. Yet, remarkably, when recounting the story years later, he often spoke about it with laughter. That attitude perhaps explains why so many people were drawn to him. Fear simply didn't seem to affect him the way it affected other people, or at least, that was the image he projected. The reality was probably more complicated, but the legend continued to grow. Every away trip added another story. Every confrontation added another chapter. Every victory added another layer to the reputation. And before long, football supporters from rival clubs were hearing the same name: Paul Doyle. One Punch Doyle. The Salford lad who always seemed to be at the centre of the action. Yet some of the most significant moments would come much closer to home. Not in Europe, not abroad, but under the famous twin towers of Wembley Stadium. Finals, big occasions, massive crowds, and rival firms arriving from every corner of the country. For football hooligans, these were often the biggest days of the year. And when Manchester United reached Wembley, Doyle and his associates were usually there. One such occasion came against Chelsea, a fixture already carrying a long history of hostility. By the time supporters arrived in London, tensions were already high. What followed became another story added to Doyle's growing mythology. According to his own account, rival groups attempted to attack Manchester United supporters around Wembley Way. Running battles broke out, punches were thrown, and chaos unfolded around the stadium. Among the stories Doyle would later tell was an incident involving a Chelsea supporter who had become something of a target among rival fans. Whether embellished over time or not, the story became part of the folklore surrounding his nickname. Another tale repeated in pubs, football grounds and prison wings for years afterwards. But by now, something important had happened. The football violence, the criminal reputation, the stories from Salford, the tales from Europe, they were all merging together. Paul Doyle was no longer simply known in one world. He was becoming known in several. And while football provided excitement, friendship and notoriety, another reality was quietly catching up with him: the police. Because while Doyle and his associates were building reputations on the terraces, law enforcement was building files, photographs, intelligence reports, criminal records, informants. The authorities were watching, and a new generation of football intelligence officers was preparing to take a much more aggressive approach to controlling the men they viewed as Britain's most notorious hooligans. For Doyle and many others, the carefree days of football violence were about to face their greatest challenge yet. And before long, some of them would discover that escaping rival fans was much easier than escaping the attention of the police. By the mid-1990s, football hooliganism in Britain was changing. The wild days of the 1970s and 1980s were beginning to disappear. The authorities had learned lessons. New intelligence units were being created. Specialist officers were being assigned exclusively to football. And for men like Paul Doyle, the net was beginning to tighten. For years, many hooligans had operated with a sense of near invincibility. Violence often happened quickly. Evidence was limited. Witnesses rarely cooperated. And unless you were caught red-handed, there was a good chance you could walk away. But police forces across Britain were becoming more sophisticated. Football intelligence was becoming a science. And Manchester was at the forefront of that effort. One of the officers tasked with fighting football disorder was Steve Barnes. Unlike many police officers, Barnes didn't simply see football hooligans as nameless troublemakers. He understood that if he was going to stop them, he first needed to know them, individually, personally, by face, by name, by reputation. When he first arrived in the football office, the intelligence operation was relatively basic. There were photographs pinned to a board, perhaps 30 or 40 faces, many with no names attached, little more than a collection of snapshots. Barnes wanted something better, much better. So he started building what would eventually become one of the most comprehensive football intelligence collections in the country. Photo by photo, name by name, face by face. Eventually, the walls became covered. Hundreds of pictures, around 400 in total, every major face connected to Manchester United's hooligan scene. Every prominent troublemaker, every known organiser, every individual considered capable of causing disorder. The walls became what officers referred to as a rogues gallery. Photographs, addresses, criminal record numbers, background information, everything carefully catalogued. The objective was simple. If officers knew who they were looking for, they could intervene before trouble started. As Barnes later explained, part of the strategy was psychological. If a hooligan knew the police recognised him, knew his name and knew his history, perhaps that alone might make him think twice. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't. Because many of the men appearing on those walls had spent years building reputations that they were reluctant to abandon. And among those faces were individuals like Paul Doyle, men who had become fixtures within Manchester United's hooligan scene, men who seemed to appear wherever trouble occurred. Barnes spent years learning every face, studying every character, understanding friendships, understanding rivalries, understanding who mattered and who didn't. The more he learned, the more effective the intelligence operation became. But there was another weapon available to the police: informants. And Barnes was determined to develop them. The idea horrified many hooligans. The football scene was built on loyalty, trust, silence. The last thing anybody wanted was somebody talking to the police. Yet officers knew that intelligence gathered from inside a group was often far more valuable than anything obtained through surveillance. So relationships were built. Conversations took place. Sources were cultivated. And gradually, the authorities gained a clearer picture of how football hooligan firms actually operated. From the outside, supporters often imagined these groups as highly organised criminal organisations. The reality was usually messier: personal rivalries, friendship groups, strong personalities, loose networks rather than rigid structures. And within Manchester United's scene, there were plenty of strong personalities. Paul Doyle was one, but he was far from the only one. The police understood that controlling football disorder wasn't simply about arresting people. It was about understanding them, predicting them, getting ahead of them. The problem was that many hooligans understood the police just as well. especially the older generation. Many had been dealing with officers since childhood. Many had criminal backgrounds. Many understood surveillance techniques. Some even seemed to enjoy the game. A constant cat and mouse battle. One side gathering intelligence, the other side attempting to avoid it. And nowhere was that battle more evident than during major football fixtures. Every big match became an operation. Officers monitored pubs, railway stations, motorways, hotels, known meeting points. Intelligence reports circulated before games. Risk assessments were prepared. Photographs distributed. The authorities weren't simply policing football anymore. They were managing a security operation. For some supporters, it felt like overkill. For the police, it was necessary. Because they had witnessed what happened when hooliganism was left unchecked. European riots, city centre disorder, mass violence, serious injuries. And occasionally worse, the stakes were high. Yet despite all the surveillance and intelligence gathering, one reality remained unchanged. Many of the men involved weren't motivated by money. They weren't motivated by organised crime. They weren't motivated by politics. They were motivated by reputation, status, adrenaline, belonging. Things far harder to police. That made people like Paul Doyle particularly difficult to deal with, because unlike traditional criminals who might stop once the risk became too great, Doyle had spent most of his life accepting risk as normal. Prison didn't frighten him. Violence didn't frighten him. Authority certainly didn't frighten him. In many ways, he had been conditioned for conflict since childhood. The reform schools had prepared him. The streets had hardened him. Football had amplified his reputation. And now the police were attempting to contain a man who had spent decades refusing to be controlled. But eventually, every story catches up with reality. The football violence, the criminality, the constant confrontations, the years of living on the edge, they all came with consequences. And for Paul Doyle, those consequences would ultimately be measured not in days or months, but in decades. Because while his reputation continued to grow on the outside, another chapter of his life was about to consume far more time than all the others combined. Prison, a place that would eventually become almost as familiar to him as the streets of Salford themselves. And yet, strangely, it would also be the place where people would see a very different side of Paul One Punch Doyle. A side few outsiders ever got to witness. By the time Paul Doyle reached his late teens, the streets of Salford had already forged him into something unusual. Most men develop confidence through victories. Paul developed confidence through surviving punishment. Years in care homes, reform schools, detention centres, police cells, and endless violence had created a mentality that was difficult for outsiders to understand. He wasn't fearless because he thought he couldn't get hurt. He was fearless because he had already experienced hurt. The beatings from staff, the fights in dormitories, the nights sleeping with one eye open, the constant need to defend himself. All of it had taught him a lesson that would stay with him for life. If you can take punishment, you stop fearing it. And once fear disappears, dangerous things begin to happen. Paul would later explain that his greatest weapon was never his punch. It was his willingness to absorb punishment that other men couldn't. Most people entered a confrontation hoping not to get hit. Paul entered a confrontation already accepting that he would. That psychological difference changed everything. He often described seeing situations before they happened. Walking into a pub, a club, a social club, a drinking den. He would immediately scan faces, who was looking too long, who looked aggressive, who wanted to make a name for themselves. Years of survival had sharpened instincts that bordered on paranoia. But in Manchester, during the 1970s, paranoia often kept you alive. As his reputation spread, another problem emerged. People started testing him. The bigger the reputation became, the more challengers appeared. Doormen, hard men, rival gangs, local fighters, men looking for status. Many saw Doyle's size and assumed the stories couldn't possibly be true. He wasn't a giant. He wasn't built like a heavyweight. But those assumptions often ended badly. According to numerous accounts from those who knew him, Paul's fighting style was brutally simple. No posturing, no shouting, no threats, no theatrics. If he sensed trouble coming, he often struck first. Not out of courage, not necessarily out of aggression, but because his entire childhood had conditioned him to believe that hesitation got you hurt. In his own words, he never wanted to allow someone a second breath. If he thought violence was inevitable, he aimed to end it before it properly began. As stories circulated around Salford, Manchester, and beyond, the nickname started following him everywhere. One Punch. The name would eventually become part of local criminal folklore. Whether every story attached to it was true is impossible to know. Like all underworld legends, reality and exaggeration often become intertwined. But one thing is certain, the nickname stuck, and with every retelling, it grew. Soon, Paul was moving among a generation of young criminals who were beginning to make names for themselves. One figure stood above many others, a man named Paul Massey. To understand Doyle's rise, you have to understand Massey, because in many ways, the two men represented different sides of the same world. Both came from the same place. Both carried fearsome reputations. Both understood violence. But their paths, ambitions and influence would eventually make them two of the most talked about figures in Manchester's underworld. And as the 1980s approached, their names would become increasingly linked. Not just through friendship, but through a criminal landscape that was becoming more organized, more ruthless, and far more dangerous than anything either of them had experienced as children. The streets were changing, money was increasing, violence was evolving, and the next generation of criminals were about to emerge. If Paul Doyle was building a reputation as one of Manchester's most feared young fighters, there was already another name dominating conversations across the city: Paul Massey. Years later, Massey would become one of the most notorious figures in Manchester's criminal history. But during the late 1970s and early 1980s, he was simply a young Manchester lad building a following. And according to Doyle, it was impossible not to notice him. Massey had something that few men possessed: leadership. Not leadership in the traditional sense. Not boardrooms. Not business meetings. Not politics. Street leadership. The kind that can't be taught. The kind where people naturally gravitate towards you. Where tougher men willingly follow your lead. Where loyalty becomes stronger than fear. Doyle would later describe Massey as someone who attracted capable young men. Not followers. Not hangers-on. But lads who could handle themselves. The sort of people who were already making names for themselves on the streets. As Massey's influence grew, so did the opportunities. By this stage, petty theft and burglary were becoming stepping stones. The money was elsewhere. Payroll robberies, cash collections, business takings. In those days, security was primitive compared to modern standards. Shop owners carried large sums of cash. Company representatives transported wages. Bank deposits often involved little more than a man carrying a bag from one building to another. And where money moved, criminals followed. For Doyle, whose reputation increasingly rested on his willingness to use violence, this role suited him perfectly. Others might grab the money. Others might organise the job. But Doyle often found himself acting as the insurance policy, the man expected to deal with anyone who intervened. The role fitted naturally with the image already developing around him. A fighter, an enforcer, a man who wasn't afraid of confrontation. But while criminal opportunities increased, so did the dangers. The underworld wasn't a playground. Every reputation attracted rivals, every success attracted attention, and every victory created enemies. Soon, conflicts started emerging with rival groups across Manchester, particularly among nightclub door staff and security firms. Throughout the city, many clubs were controlled by powerful doormen. Some were former fighters. Some were criminals. Many were both. To young men like Doyle and his associates, these doormen represented authority. And authority was something they had spent their entire lives rebelling against. The clashes became frequent. A disagreement at a nightclub, an argument at a doorway, a challenge from a doorman wanting to test a local reputation. According to Doyle, these confrontations rarely lasted long. Once violence started, it often escalated rapidly. Word spread, stories multiplied, and every incident added another layer to his growing reputation. Meanwhile, Manchester itself had developed a unique identity. People from outside quickly learned one lesson. You didn't walk into the place looking for trouble. The community was fiercely territorial. Locals protected locals. If outsiders arrived with aggressive intentions, they often found themselves facing far more people than they expected. It wasn't just gangs. It was a culture, a mentality, an area that viewed itself as separate from Manchester, separate from authority, separate from everyone else. And for young men raised in that environment, loyalty to your own people became everything. By now, Doyle was no longer the frightened child sleeping in dormitories, no longer the runaway sleeping in public toilets, no longer the boy being dragged back to reform school. He had become something else entirely. A recognized figure in the local growing criminal scene. A young man with a fearsome reputation. A reputation that would soon take him far beyond local pubs and street fights. Because the criminal underworld of Manchester was changing. Organized groups were becoming larger. Money was becoming bigger. Weapons were beginning to appear, and the era of fists was slowly giving way to something far more dangerous. For men like Paul Doyle and Paul Massey, the next chapter would bring greater rewards, but it would also bring consequences that neither could escape. By the early 1980s, Manchester's criminal landscape was beginning to evolve. The old villains were still around. The men who had built reputations through robberies, safe-cracking, gambling protection, and traditional organized crime. But a younger generation was emerging. Men who had grown up differently. Men who had been shaped by care homes, borstalls, football violence, unemployment, and increasingly hostile streets. Paul Doyle belonged firmly to that new generation. Unlike many old-school criminals, he hadn't drifted into crime. He had almost been conditioned for it. By his own admission, when he finally left the reform school system shortly before his 18th birthday, he felt completely disconnected from ordinary life. He couldn't read properly. He struggled with writing. He had spent almost his entire childhood institutionalized. Most importantly, he didn't have a trade. No qualifications, no career path, no roadmap. While other young men were starting apprenticeships or factory jobs, Doyle saw himself as something else entirely. A villain. It wasn't glamour. It wasn't ambition. It was simply the identity he had been carrying since childhood. The streets were the only world he truly understood, and the streets welcomed him back immediately. The local pubs became his classroom, the local criminals became his teachers, the local reputations became his competition. Every weekend brought another confrontation, another challenge, another opportunity to prove himself. As stories spread, his reputation continued growing. Many older criminals found themselves surprised. The stories didn't seem to match the man. He wasn't particularly tall. He wasn't some giant heavyweight. Yet people kept talking about him, kept mentioning his name, kept telling stories about fights that ended quickly and violently. Whether every story was accurate mattered less than the effect it created. Fear often travels faster than truth, and Doyle's reputation was beginning to travel. One thing separated him from many others. He genuinely enjoyed confrontation. Not because he was reckless, not because he was insane, but because fighting had become normal. For most people, violence is something extraordinary. For Doyle, violence had been ordinary since childhood. The reform schools had normalized it. The streets had reinforced it. The criminal world rewarded it. And now, people were actively seeking him out because of it. The result was predictable. His reputation continued to grow. But so did the dangers surrounding him. Manchester was becoming increasingly competitive. Different groups controlled different territories. Different firms controlled different opportunities. And every ambitious young criminal wanted a piece of the action. The city's nightclub scene was exploding. Security firms were becoming powerful. Door supervisors were developing reputations of their own. Some clubs were effectively controlled by organized criminal groups. Others became battlegrounds where reputations could be won or lost in minutes. Doyle found himself in the middle of that world. According to his own accounts, confrontations with doormen became increasingly common. Many wanted to test him. Some wanted to make a name for themselves. Others simply didn't like the growing reputation surrounding the young Manchester fighter. But every challenge seemed to strengthen the mythology. Every confrontation added another story. Every story added another layer to the legend. Before long, people weren't just talking about Paul Doyle. They were talking about Paul Doyle and Paul Massey. The two names increasingly appeared together, one renowned for violence, the other renowned for leadership. One a fighter, one an organizer. Both products of the same place, both commanding respect, both attracting loyal followers, and both becoming increasingly influential within Manchester's underworld. Yet neither man could have predicted what was coming, because during the mid-1980s, Manchester would experience a transformation unlike anything it had seen before. Nightclubs would become gold mines. Drugs would flood the city. Old criminal hierarchies would collapse. New fortunes would be made overnight. And the violence that once revolved around fists would gradually become something much darker. The streets that had created Paul Doyle were about to change forever. And those changes would drag him into a far more dangerous world than simple pub fights and local reputations. By the mid-1980s, a new battleground had emerged across Manchester. It wasn't the streets, it wasn't the pubs, it wasn't even the football grounds. It was the nightclub doors. For young criminals and hard men, the city's nightlife offered something valuable: money, status, influence, control. Whoever controlled the doors often controlled everything that happened inside. The drinks, the protection, the dealers, the troublemakers, the VIPs, the entire ecosystem of Manchester's nightlife. As clubs grew busier, the men standing on those doors became increasingly powerful. Many were experienced fighters. Others were criminals, using legitimate security work as a cover. Some were feared more than the gangsters inside. For Paul Doyle, confrontation with door staff became almost inevitable. His reputation had reached a stage where people wanted to challenge him, not because they necessarily hated him, but because beating Paul Doyle meant instant credibility. If a boxer defeats a champion, people remember. The same logic existed on Manchester's streets. Doyle later described how some doormen actively looked for opportunities, a comment, a disagreement, a stare too long, anything that might lead to violence, because reputations were currency, and everyone wanted more of it. But Doyle was operating with a mindset few others possessed. He never waited comfortably for trouble. His years in reform schools had conditioned him differently. He believed that hesitation was dangerous. If violence looked inevitable, he preferred to act first. That approach created a fearsome reputation, not because he was unbeatable, but because he was unpredictable. Most confrontations follow a pattern: words, threats, posturing, a chance to back down. Doyle often skipped those stages entirely. The result was that many confrontations ended before they properly began. Stories spread across Manchester, stories spread across town, stories spread through pubs, clubs and criminal circles, and every retelling made the legend larger. By now, younger lads were beginning to attach themselves to established names. They wanted protection, status, opportunity, and in many cases, excitement. Doyle understood exactly how dangerous that could be, because he had once been one of those young lads himself. The difference was that he had earned his reputation through years of institutional violence. Many newcomers wanted the reputation without understanding the consequences. That worried some older criminals. The city was changing, fast. And beneath the surface, something else was happening. A new economy was emerging. At first, it seemed insignificant. A few dealers, a few pills, a few nightclub connections. Nothing compared to armed robberies or organized theft. But the smart criminals were paying attention because they could see where the money was heading. And the money was becoming enormous. The old villains had chased wages vans, bank deposits, cash collections. The next generation would chase something different: drugs, nightlife, and eventually, control of entire territories. For men like Paul Massey, opportunities were expanding rapidly. For men like Paul Doyle, opportunities and danger were expanding together. The streets were no longer ruled simply by who could fight. Money was beginning to matter more than fists. Influence was beginning to matter more than fear. And soon, Manchester would enter a period that would change its criminal underworld forever. The era of old-school villains was fading. A new generation was taking control. And with it came a level of violence that even hardened men from Manchester had never experienced before. The city was about to become one of the most notorious criminal battlegrounds in Britain. And Paul Doyle was standing right in the middle of it. By now, Paul Doyle was becoming known across Manchester for one thing above all else: violence. But according to Doyle himself, most people misunderstood what drove him. They saw the reputation, the stories, the fights, the fear. What they didn't see was the mindset underneath it all. Years later, during interviews, Doyle would repeatedly return to one idea: surrender. Not surrendering in a fight. Surrendering mentally. As a teenager, Doyle had already convinced himself that prison was inevitable. He believed that a life sentence might eventually come. He believed that violence would always be part of his future. He believed that the system had already decided what he was going to become. And because he accepted that outcome so young, he stopped fearing it. That acceptance made him dangerous. Most people commit crimes while trying to avoid consequences. Doyle believed the consequences were already waiting for him. He often described how this mentality removed hesitation, removed fear, removed self-preservation. When a man thinks he still has everything to lose, he calculates risks. When a man thinks his future is already written, calculations disappear. That was the mentality developing inside Doyle during the 1980s. And it wasn't unique to him. Many young criminals from similar backgrounds shared the same outlook. Broken homes, institutional care, prison from an early age, constant violence, no education, no employment opportunities. Many reached adulthood already expecting failure, already expecting prison, already expecting an early death. Doyle would later say that this was one of the greatest dangers facing young men. Not violence, not crime. Surrender. The moment somebody accepts that their future is hopeless, the moment they stop believing there is another path. For Doyle, that surrender had happened years earlier. At 17, he wasn't trying to avoid becoming a criminal. He was trying to become the best criminal he could be. That distinction is important because it explains much of what followed. As his reputation grew, opportunities multiplied. People sought him out. Some wanted protection. Some wanted friendship. Some wanted him on their side when trouble arrived. Others simply wanted access to his growing network. And networks mattered. The underworld ran on relationships, trust, loyalty, fear, reputation. A man could earn money alone. But real power came through connections. By this stage, Doyle was increasingly surrounded by ambitious young criminals. Many would go on to become significant names in Manchester's underworld. Others would end up dead. Some would disappear into long prison sentences. The streets were beginning to sort people into categories: the survivors, the victims, and the prisoners. Nobody knew which category they would eventually fall into. Not yet. But warning signs were already appearing. Manchester itself was changing rapidly. The city centre was busier. The nightclub scene was booming. The money being generated at weekends was unlike anything seen before. Criminals were adapting. Old crimes were becoming less attractive. Why risk a major robbery when easier money was appearing elsewhere? That question would reshape Manchester's underworld, because soon a new drug culture would arrive. And with it would come fortunes, power struggles, gang wars, and a level of violence that would dwarf the fistfights of previous decades. For men like Doyle, the transition would be impossible to avoid. The city was entering a new era, the age of the nightclub entrepreneur, the doorman kingpin, the organised gang, the drug dealer, and eventually the gunman. The world of old-school villains was disappearing. A far more ruthless world was taking its place. And many of the men who had grown up fighting with their fists would soon find themselves navigating a criminal landscape where fists were no longer enough. For most of his life, Paul Doyle had operated in a world governed by simple rules. Respect, reputation, violence. If somebody crossed a line, there was usually a fight. If somebody owed money, there was pressure. If somebody caused problems, there was retaliation. It was brutal, but it was familiar. By the late 1980s, however, that world was beginning to disappear. A new Manchester was emerging, and with it came a new type of criminal. The city was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. Nightclubs were booming. Bars were packed every weekend. Young people suddenly had money to spend. Fashion was changing. Music was changing. The entire culture was changing, and wherever large amounts of money appeared, organised criminals followed. For older villains, the traditional jobs were becoming less attractive. Armed robberies carried huge risks. Payroll robberies were becoming harder. Banks were improving security. But inside Manchester's growing nightlife industry, fortunes could be made every single weekend, without masks, without getaway cars, without sawn-off shotguns, at least initially. The nightclub scene became a magnet for ambitious men, door supervisors, promoters, security firms, drug dealers, local gangsters. Everyone wanted a piece of the action. Many of the city's most feared figures began gravitating towards the same venues, the same bars, the same clubs, the same circles. It created a unique environment. Some nights, rival criminals could be standing only a few feet apart, or making money, or watching each other, or measuring each other. For men like Paul Doyle, who had built their reputations through physical confrontation, the environment created both opportunities and dangers. Because influence was starting to replace fear, money was starting to replace muscle, connections were becoming more important than fists. Some adapted, some didn't. Doyle remained what he had always been. A fighter. A man whose reputation came from his willingness to confront danger head-on. But around him, the game was evolving. The younger generation entering the criminal world weren't necessarily interested in proving themselves physically. They wanted wealth, status, cars, nightclubs, designer clothes, and increasingly, drugs. This was the beginning of a major shift. The old school villain often fought for pride. The new generation fought for profit, and profit could be far more ruthless than pride. Throughout Manchester, established criminal groups began strengthening their positions. Territories became important. Venues became important. Relationships became important. Every successful nightclub, every lucrative door contract, every profitable operation suddenly mattered, because behind each one sat money, serious money, the kind of money that attracted dangerous attention. Years later, many people would look back on this period as a crossroads, the final years before everything changed, before firearms became commonplace, before organised gang warfare escalated, before Manchester gained national notoriety for its violent criminal conflicts. At the time, few people realised what was coming. They simply enjoyed the opportunities, the nightlife, the money, the excitement. But beneath the surface, tensions were building. Old rivalries remained unresolved. New rivalries were forming, and increasingly, ambitious young criminals were entering a world where reputations alone were no longer enough. For Paul Doyle, it marked the start of another chapter, one that would take him deeper into Manchester's underworld than ever before. Because while the city was becoming richer, more fashionable and more successful on the surface, the criminal world beneath it was becoming far more dangerous. And some of the bloodiest years were still to come. If there was one thing Paul Doyle never feared, it was prison. That might sound strange. Most criminals spend their lives trying to avoid it. Paul had spent most of his childhood inside institutions. In many ways, prison felt less like a destination and more like a continuation. By the time he reached adulthood, he had already lived through children's homes, approved schools, detention centres, and borstalls. Locked doors weren't new. Authority wasn't new. Violence certainly wasn't new. The difference was that now he was entering the adult system. And adult prisons were a different world entirely. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, many of the names being whispered around Manchester's underworld were also becoming familiar inside Britain's prisons. The same men who controlled nightclub doors, the same men involved in robberies, the same men building criminal empires. Sooner or later, most of them ended up behind bars. Doyle was no exception, and prison quickly became another stage where reputations mattered. Inside, people knew who he was. Stories travelled fast, sometimes faster than the prisoners themselves. A man could arrive at a jail and discover half the population already knew his nickname, already knew his reputation, already knew the rumours. That brought respect, but it also brought problems, because prison operates under the same unwritten rule as the streets. If you're known, somebody will eventually want to test you, especially if your reputation is built on violence. Yet prison also revealed another side of Paul Doyle, a side rarely mentioned in newspaper reports, a side that didn't fit the hard man stereotype. Years later, prison officers who worked alongside him would describe a completely different character. Not a bully, not a predator, not a man constantly looking for conflict. Instead, they described someone who helped vulnerable prisoners, someone who spent time talking to mentally ill inmates, someone who looked after weaker prisoners who had nobody else. One former prison officer would later say that Doyle was one of the nicest men he had ever met inside prison. That statement surprises people, because it clashes with everything they think they know. How can somebody have a fearsome reputation on the streets and still be respected by prison staff? The answer is that human beings are rarely one-dimensional. The same experiences that created Doyle's violent side also gave him something else. Empathy. He understood abandonment. He understood fear. He understood what it felt like to be trapped. Many of the mentally ill prisoners he encountered were fighting battles nobody else could see. And perhaps Doyle recognized something familiar in them. Perhaps he saw aspects of his own childhood. Whatever the reason, numerous accounts suggest he spent significant amounts of time helping others inside, playing cards, talking, keeping people calm, helping maintain order when tensions rose. It didn't erase his criminal past, it didn't excuse the violence, but it added complexity. And complexity is often missing from stories about underworld figures, because real life is rarely black and white. The truth is that many feared criminals are capable of kindness, and many respectable people are capable of cruelty. Prison exposed those contradictions every day. For Doyle, however, prison remained prison. No matter how comfortable you become inside, freedom always waits outside the gate. And eventually, every prisoner starts thinking about release, thinking about the future, thinking about unfinished business. The problem for men like Paul Doyle was that freedom didn't necessarily mean escape. Because while he served sentences inside, Manchester's underworld continued evolving outside. The money kept growing, the rivalries kept growing, the violence kept growing. And when Doyle eventually returned to the streets, he would be stepping back into a criminal landscape far more dangerous than the one he had left. The fists were slowly disappearing. The guns were arriving. And Manchester was heading towards a bloody chapter that would make national headlines. For all the violence, all the prison sentences, and all the criminal reputations that surrounded Paul Doyle's life, there was one thing he valued above everything else. Loyalty. Not money, not status, not fear. Loyalty. And few people embody that ideal more than Paul Massey. To outsiders, Massey was one of Manchester's most controversial figures. To supporters, he was a community figure. To police, he was a major underworld player. To journalists, he was often described as a gangland boss. But to Paul Doyle, he was something much simpler. A friend. And not just any friend. One of the most important people he had ever known. Throughout interviews, Doyle speaks about Massey with a level of respect rarely heard when discussing other criminals. There is no bravado, no exaggeration, no storytelling, just genuine admiration. He describes a man who inspired fierce loyalty, a man who could attract capable people around him, a man whose influence stretched far beyond criminal circles. In Doyle's eyes, Massey wasn't respected because people feared him. He was respected because people would willingly stand beside him. That distinction mattered, because in the underworld, fear can disappear overnight. Respect lasts longer. Doyle often suggested that if somebody had a serious problem, if somebody genuinely needed help, Massey was the sort of man people turned to. That reputation earned him both friends and enemies. Lots of both. And in Manchester's criminal world, enemies have a habit of accumulating, particularly when power is involved. The old gangs had evolved. New gangs had emerged. Drug markets had expanded. Firearms had become commonplace. The violence was different now, more calculated, more ruthless, less personal. The days of settling disputes with fists outside pubs had largely disappeared. The new generation often reached for guns, and guns changed everything. Then came July 2015. The news spread quickly. Paul Massey had been shot dead outside his home. The man once considered untouchable. The man many viewed as one of the most powerful figures in Manchester's underworld. Gone. Killed in a hail of bullets. The murder shocked people across Greater Manchester, not because violence was unusual, but because of who the victim was. Massey had survived decades in one of Britain's toughest criminal environments. He had built alliances, made enemies, accumulated influence. Yet in the end, he suffered the same fate as countless others who had lived by underworld rules. Doyle later spoke about the loss with obvious sadness. Not anger, not revenge. Sadness. The sadness of losing someone who had been part of his life for decades. The sadness of watching another chapter of history come to an end. Because Massey's death symbolized something bigger. The passing of an era. An era of larger-than-life characters. Men whose reputations had been built on physical courage, leadership, and presence. Men who dominated rooms without needing social media, without needing publicity, without needing headlines. Whether people admired them or despised them, they couldn't ignore them. And now many of those figures were disappearing, some through prison, some through age, some through violence. As Doyle looked around, more and more familiar faces were gone. The old crew was shrinking. The stories remained. The memories remained. But the people themselves were vanishing. That reality forced reflection. Because eventually every criminal, every fighter, every gangster reaches the same destination. The point where they stop looking forward and start looking back. And when Paul Doyle looked back across his life, he saw something few young men entering crime ever consider. Not the victories, not the money, not the reputation, but the casualties, the friends who never made it, the years that vanished, the opportunities lost, and the realization that every legend, no matter how feared, eventually becomes a memory. When people hear the name Paul One Punch Doyle, they usually think of violence. They think of the stories, the knockouts, the gang wars, the football hooliganism, the robberies, the prison sentences, the reputation. And to be fair, all of those things happened. Paul Doyle never pretended otherwise. He never claimed to be innocent. He never rewrote history. He never tried to present himself as something he wasn't. For most of his life, he lived exactly as he chose. And he paid the price. This was a long story, so thank you to those that stayed until the end. I appreciate your support greatly. Check out my other similar stories on my YouTube channel. You can also find me on Facebook by typing on Everything Casual and my page will pop up. Click like and subscribe, and that way you will be notified when we put a new video out. It also helps our channel grow. So a huge thank you. See you next time.